We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. On June 12th, Israeli warplanes began bombing targets in Iran. On June 21st, Donald Trump went before the nation in a televised address to announce that the United States had sent B-2 bombers to drop 30,000-pound bombs on Iranian targets. And then Trump unilaterally declared a ceasefire. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking once again with Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi is an expert in American studies. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. Mohammad, welcome back to the Socialist Program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. Mohammad, we need to talk about what's going on inside Iran. You know, what's missing in the U.S. narrative almost always is an Iranian perspective, and especially someone who's in Iran. There's lots of pundits who are sitting in London or Paris or New York talking about Iran, but they're not there, and you are there. So I want to get your take, your assessment, your analysis of what's happened in these last 2 weeks. But before we do, I saw you on Press TV, one of the English language Iranian TV networks. You were doing an interview, and at that time, and I believe in the same complex where Iranian national TV and radio is located, Israeli bombs basically targeted the studio. You were there. Everyone was, people who knew you were extremely concerned of whether you had actually survived. Other people undoubtedly didn't survive, or other people were certainly injured. What happened?
Well, I was using the Press TV building for the internet because the government had slowed down the internet since the Israeli regime was using it to attack Iranians. And so the only place I could do interviews like this was from the Press TV building itself. And I was preparing for an interview with Piers Morgan when the central building for the Iranian National Radio and Television, which is on the screen, it was bombed. And there were live programs being carried out from there, including a woman, which you may have seen. She was speaking, and then her studio exploded. And there were also two other women. One was a radio presenter. She was also in studio working when the building was attacked with 4 missiles. And there was a third woman presenting for a children's program. And all three survived, but others didn't. Some journalists were murdered. And it's interesting that these 3 journalists, these 3 presenters, were all women. And no one in the West, and in mainstream media, legacy media, these feminist, well-funded, feminist organizations that are connected to the powerful in the United States and in the West, none of them said anything. They didn't care they don't care about Iranian women, obviously. So I was in a separate building that belonged to the Iranian National Radio and TV, the Press TV, and they evacuated the building when the other building in the central complex was attacked. But I refused to leave because I was about to do the interview with Piers Morgan. And so the poor guard kept pushing and insisting, and then he said, "I'm sitting here until you leave." And then I was in the backstage of Piers Morgan's show, and his people saw me yelling at him and telling him to leave, and I told them that, look, I'm in a rush. And they, instead of putting me into the program sooner, they delayed it. I went in my piece, my part in the debate began much later than they had promised. Not that they wanted to hurt me or anything, but they were obviously indifferent to my situation. So while the building was empty when I did the interview, and I left the building afterwards, but again, even though it was still evacuated, I came back in a couple of hours later to do Judge Napolitano's show because if I couldn't do the interview outside the building. So I insisted, they let me in. I did that interview, went out again. Then an hour or two later, I had an RT interview, so I went into the building. So every time I did interviews during those days, I had to go inside an empty the empty Press TV building to do so. So that was basically it. But they never struck the Press TV building. But it is outrageous that they would target journalists and an iconic building, building number one for Iranian national radio and TV, and no one in the West, Western governments, Western journalists said anything. And the fact that all of the presenters at that time happened to be women, those whose studios were in that building, because they have other buildings too, all of them were women, but it had absolutely no impact, no significance to the West, to the elites.
Well, this is sadly, tragically, but predictably the pattern where all of the concern for human life and damage is for others, not certainly for the Iranian people. Mohammed, let's just go back to what actually happened. The Israelis began bombing on June 12th. The U.S. joined in on June 21st. Donald Trump, went on national TV and said that B-2 bombers had gone and dropped 30,000-pound bombs on 3 different Iranian civilian nuclear energy sites, and that they had been obliterated by the U.S. bombing. And he was very proud. He was filled with conceit and braggadocio. The American people, Mohammed, are not for this. They weren't for it. We had demonstrations within 12 hours in 30 cities in the United States, within 12 hours after Trump spoke. I mean, we had thousands, perhaps in aggregate, tens of thousands of people overnight. And then Trump ended the war. And I think, from my point of view, if he hadn't ended the war, those demonstrations would have become hundreds of thousands and maybe millions, because like the Iraq War, which was based on lies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, Iraq's so-called capacity to destroy large places or huge numbers of people, that was a lie. The American people, this is etched into the consciousness of the American people. So immediately, anti-war sentiment started blossoming, I would say sort of taking off big time. But let's go over why the Israelis carried out an unprovoked attack against Iran, and why the U.S., which is technically at peace with Iran, joined in and dropping 30,000-pound bombs on Iran. Why did they do it?
Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency, first of all, is an organization like all other international organizations created after the Second World War that's controlled by the West. The Board of Governors is a political entity. It's not a technical entity. And if I'm not mistaken, 17 of the 35 board members are European and North American. And 2 others are South Korea and Japan, which are loyal to the United States, so they have a majority. They voted against Iran and criticizing Iran, and the head of the organization misled people in a statement about Iran. So they tried to make it seem as if Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapon. And then, which was a lie, and there was no evidence for this, and the Global South voted against it. And the global majority, China voted against it, Russia voted against it, India didn't vote for it, Brazil didn't vote for it. So the global minority, since they have disproportionate power in these organizations, they were able to use that organization to create an environment to justify war. And the head of the organization, he's in the American camp. According to WikiLeaks, the previous head of the organization, Amano, who was Japanese, when he wanted to become the head, he went and told the Americans, I'm with you on all issues. I'm your man. Just, if you get me in, I do what you say. And that's what happened. The same is true for this guy. So they created an environment to justify Israeli aggression. And then we saw immediately Western media, from liberal to conservative, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, Breitbart, New York Times, all of them suddenly turned and began to demonize Iran, began to spread misinformation to prepare the grounds for murder and slaughter. Very similar to what we saw after October the 7th, when they started lying about beheaded babies and raped women and all those lies. They were all being spread so that the Israelis could commit genocide, so that they could commit a Holocaust. And so they lied about October the 7th and spoke about beheaded babies and lied about that and lied about raped women so that they could justify the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust in Gaza. And so the Western media is basically a tool for the powerful, the legacy media. And they did the same with Iran. When they wanted to prepare the ground for war, although Trump said, I'm against it, behind the scenes, it turned out the night before he was trying to deceive Iran as Iran was negotiating. So he said, I'm against war. And then the next day we saw when the Israelis attacked, he said, he basically said, I was behind all this. I was with the Israeli regime. He was gloating about it. And then as soon as before the war started, before the unprovoked war started, we saw the Western media do the same with Iran as they did with Gaza, demonizing Iran, attacking Iran, all the media, left to right, Breitbart, New York Times, everyone. So this is how it began. So it was based on lies, deception, propaganda, and they thought that they would score a big win against Iran. They attacked civilian targets. They murdered senior officials, especially in the military. Many senior commanders were murdered. And what they would do is they would there was an apartment where they destroyed the whole apartment. Almost 70 people, roughly 70 people were murdered, including more than 20 children in that building because they wanted to take out one or two people. So they massacred everyone. And the other targets were the same. They would blow up buildings just to get one person. They would kill neighbors, they would kill children, grandchildren. That's how the Israelis are. And then Western media would present this as some sort of brilliant intelligence operation and military operation. Why? Because they kill people in their homes, as if their homes are some secret. People living in Tehran, people's neighbors, they all know who their neighbors are, especially if the person's been on television or he's famous. So the West tried to glorify the Israeli regime. Why? I think there are two reasons. One is to whitewash the regime for the ongoing, as we speak, it's still ongoing, genocide in Gaza. And two, to justify aggression against Iran. But despite Trump's gloating, within a couple of days, the tide began to turn. Iran brought in new commanders, and they began to regroup, and Iran began to hit the Israeli regime, and the tide began to turn. And ultimately, the reason why Trump attacked Iran was because the Israelis were losing the war. And then the reason why Trump then later pushed for a ceasefire was because Netanyahu was begging for a ceasefire. Why? Because even after Trump's intervention, the situation got progressively worse. And as everyone saw, it was the Iranians during the last 2 hours before the ceasefire that were striking the Israeli regime with missiles and drones across the country.
Mohammad, I want to play a clip. It's Donald Trump acknowledging what you just said. This is after the ceasefire, and he's basically saying Israel got hit really, really hard by Iran's ballistic missiles. Let's listen and watch this video clip.
They've got a country, and they've got oil, and they're very smart people, and they can come back. Israel got hit very hard, especially the last couple of days. Israel was hit really hard. Those ballistic missiles, boy, they took out a lot of buildings.
That's Donald Trump saying, what the Iranians have been basically saying, what you're saying is that the ceasefire was basically a consequence not of some grand peace move by Trump, As some people are saying, he wanted to get the Nobel Peace Prize, but actually a reflection of the relationship of forces such that the war had turned against Israel, against the U.S. Ally. And again, there is a constraint here, everyone, because the American government, even though it's completely behind Israel and gives Israel a blank check for everything, including genocide, there is constraint based on American public opinion. No leader, no matter how much they want to act like a king or a queen, can completely ignore public opinion in the modern era. And public opinion in the United States, I can say categorically, was against this. I want to play another clip real fast before I turn it back to you. This is a Trump supporter, Steve Bannon, who has a podcast now, a longtime Trump leader of one wing of the Trump coalition. Anyway, listen to what Bannon said.
Yesterday they took this ceasefire was as much to save Israel. That's the hidden story here. They bit off way more than they could chew. They were played out as far. Yesterday was a brutal day for the citizens of Israel. Took horrible incomings, particularly in Tel Aviv, and I guess Beersheba also. They needed this because they were running out of defensive ammunition.
In a court of law, Mohammed, that would be called a statement against interest, meaning having Donald Trump and Steve Bannon say what you're saying and what we're saying. It's one thing if it comes from you. It's one thing if it comes from the Answer Coalition. But this is a statement against interest because these are the people who love Israel and support the genocide. They're saying basically what you're saying, that Israel couldn't really withstand the war. Go ahead.
Yes, and there's also the added dimension of the airstrikes that the Americans carried out, and of course before them on the Iranian nuclear sites. In Western media, we're now hearing that Western intelligence agencies believe that these strikes were largely ineffective, and that they didn't do severe damage to the program itself. They only destroyed buildings on the ground, but Iran's key installations are all deep underground. So not only did Iran remove its everything that was important from those installations on the ground, but it seems, according to U.S. intelligence, that in Fordo, those heavy bombings did not really do damage to the underground facilities. So this unjustified war of aggression on civilians and civilian targets and on a civilian nuclear program failed. And it's interesting that the buildings that were targeted, they were all buildings that the inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency would regularly visit. And they've never said in any report, these scientists, these experts, that Iran is building a nuclear weapon, that Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. There's never. So they bombed the same buildings that are regularly inspected. So these are all war crimes. And while the Israelis and the Americans were bombing installations where we could have had leaked radiation, potentially, that could kill people and ruin the environment and cause a huge catastrophe, the West was supporting the strikes. The International Atomic Energy Agency refused to condemn Israel or the United States for attacking civilian nuclear sites, and the Europeans and the North Americans and their allies were saying that Israel has the right to defend itself. So when the Israeli regime, it slaughters Palestinians and carries out a genocide, it's defending itself. When it slaughters people in Lebanon, it's defending itself. When it helps ISIS and Al-Qaeda come to power in Syria, it's defending itself. When it's bombing Iran and murdering women and children and striking civilian targets, it's defending itself. That is the real nature of the elites in the United States and Europe.
The New York Times, speaking to your point, Mohammed, says in its headline, Strike set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months, U.S. report says. Preliminary classified findings indicate that the attack, meaning the American attack with these 30,000-pound bombs, sealed off the entrances to the two facilities but did not collapse their underground buildings. A preliminary classified U.S. report says the American bombing of the three nuclear sites did not obliterate the sites. Now, Donald Trump, Mohammed, is calling this scum media. I mean, amazing language. He's calling the American media, the corporate-owned, capitalist-owned U.S. media, the same media that comes to his White House briefings every day and asks him like simple, inane, non-threatening questions. They're now the scum media because they've released a finding, a preliminary finding by U.S. intelligence speaking directly to what you said and confirming directly the point that you're making, that as big and bad as those bombs are, and they're big and they're bad, they are inherently a war crime because they can't, anything underneath them dies. That doesn't distinguish between civilian and soldier. It's inherently a war crime, the way an atomic bomb would be. But nonetheless, from a military point of view, did not accomplish the mission. And so Donald Trump, this irate, thin-skinned leader of the United States, is calling this scum media because they said, yeah, what the Iranians said is basically accurate. What you said is essentially untrue.
Yes, and I think it shows how sophisticated the Iranians are, and that the Iranians are able to build structures, and their engineers are capable of building centers for science and for the economy to develop new technologies and to bring new technologies into practice. They're able to construct these sites in a way in which the United States, in an unprovoked act of aggression, is incapable of destroying them. And despite the fact that we had this blitzkrieg by the Israeli regime against the Iranian people, the Iranians were capable of regrouping. Even though so many senior commanders were murdered, they were able to swiftly regroup, strike back, and defeat this coalition that the Israeli regime, with the whole of NATO behind it, the whole of the West behind it, Western elites and the regimes, and regional regimes were with the Americans. No one helped Iran. Radar bases in Turkey, in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Bahrain, across the board, in US bases, were being used to help the Israelis carry out their offensive attacks and to help the Israeli regime defend itself. The Jordanian regime allowed their airspace to be used by the Israelis and the Americans to down Iranian drones and to prevent Iranian missiles, if they could, from hitting their targets. So you saw this huge coalition of client regimes in the region, NATO regimes, and the collective West working with the Israeli regime. And then you saw direct US strikes on Iran, but it failed. And Iran won the war, despite the pain, despite the suffering, despite the martyrs. But Iran won the war. And the Israeli regime was begging for a ceasefire. And the entire world knows what this war is about. It was not about the nuclear program. It was not about human rights. It was not about any such thing. It was about Iran's support for the Palestinian people. That's why Iran has been punished for 45, 46 years, ever since the revolution. Iran is being attacked because of its support for the Palestinian people, just like Yemen. That is what all the demonization over the last few decades has been about. That's what all the sanctions have been about. That's what all the color revolutions and the sanctions and the terrorist attacks against Iranians over the decades have all been about. It's been about Iran's independence and Iran's support for the Palestinian people against the wishes of the West.
Mohammed, the Shah of Iran took power in a U.S. British intelligence-led coup d'etat in 1953. And when the Shah came to power, the tyrant, the king, the monarch, the dictator, he denationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which had been nationalized by the democratically elected government, returned it to its British owners, BP, now known as BP, and then eventually Gulf Oil, because the U.S. was part of the coup. They got 40% share of Iran's oil. That whole sort of era has, Iranians know all of this history, but the American people don't know it. Obama alluded to it in 2009 when he spoke in Cairo at a conference right after coming into office following the debacle of the George W. Bush administration. But this is an indication that the U.S. has actually been at war against Iran for a long time. So yes, right now, Iran is supporting Palestine. And so it's receives the wrath of the Israeli regime with the backing of the U.S. But every effort by Iran to be independent as well, to be self-determining, has been met with just complete animus and hostility by the U.S. And the Shah, who was a dictator, not a Democrat, who ruled with an iron fist for 26 years, when he's toppled in 1979, by a people's revolution, that's when the United States breaks relations with Iran. Before that, the U.S. was even facilitating Iran having a nuclear program, something else that Americans don't know. The U.S. brought nuclear power to Iran as long as it was a U.S. puppet dictator on the throne. So there's multiple reasons why Iran is in the crosshairs. And I want you to talk about that, some of that history a little bit. And also when you think about Iranian public opinion, and I'll stop here. I mean, obviously, Iran is not a dictatorship now because there's obviously divided public opinion in Iran. There's very contentious elections. And yet I would think that the Iranian people in the main, having known this history under the circumstances of the past 2 weeks, would even overcome sharply divided political opinions in defense of their own sovereignty. I mean, you're there, I'm just speculating. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, first I should answer the first part, and then I'll get to the second part, which is very, very, very important and a very big miscalculation on behalf of the West. The West miscalculated big time here, and the Israeli regime. The war against Iran and the Iranian people began in the 1950s with the coup. And the British wanted control of Iranian natural resources, oil in particular, and that's why they overthrew the national government. And they installed a dictator who was in power for 2.5 decades. They created the U.S., they created the notorious secret police, the Savak. And when the Shah was gunning down people on the streets during the revolution, very large numbers of people with his army, the U.S. president at that time, Jimmy Carter, who was supposedly the most decent of them all, he called the Shah the next morning after particularly probably the worst day of killing, which was called Black Friday in Iran. He called the Shah the next day and gave him his full support. So, and then when after the revolution took place, U.S. animosity, became, it just went out of control. They supported Saddam Hussein invading the country. They imposed sanctions until they reached maximum pressure sanctions, which Obama put in place, and we know the history. So, the United States, it was initially about oil and about sovereignty, and then it became about sovereignty, independence, and Iran's support for the Palestinian people, but not just the Palestinian people. The Shah was exporting 90% of South Africa's oil was being exported by Iran. Iran would sell apartheid South Africa that oil. As soon as the revolution happened, Iran cut off ties with apartheid South Africa and ended the oil trade. And of course, the same was true with the Israeli regime. And of course, Iran has been supporting Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and any country that has been under U.S. pressure and sanctions. So it is about this, but first and foremost is Iran's support for the Palestinian people, because apartheid and ethno-supremacism in Palestine is something very dear to the elites in the United States and Europe. And we see that through their support of this ongoing Holocaust. For them, it's not just that the Zionists who believe that Palestinians and Arabs are Amalek. It is the entire Western elites. That's why they're supporting this. That's why they support the murder of Iranian women and children too, because we are Amalek too. We're all Amalek. When one set of people are chosen people, allegedly, everyone else is, of course, not chosen. And so that is where we are now. But, and this is the important point, the United States has miscalculated. So have the Europeans. They rely on these so-called Iran experts who are bought and paid for, who are hired at universities and think tanks to say what needs to be said, for the most part. Not all academics who work on Iran are like that. So you have these so-called Iran experts and who say what the governments in the West and the elites want to hear. And then they're well-funded. They invite these politicians, give them huge honorariums to speak against Iran. And this cycle of wealth just continues and narrative building. And so the West believes, and the elites in the West, so the US believes the propaganda that Iran is weak, Iran is falling apart, the so-called regime is hated by the Iranian people, it's about to implode, just put on more sanctions, put on more pressure, and it's over. The Europeans believe that, the Israeli regime believes that, and so when they attacked, they thought that they would have a quick win and that the Islamic Republic of Iran would collapse. But since they don't understand and they believe their own propaganda, they got it completely wrong. And people rallied. And the country is united today in a way in which I have not seen since Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, since Saddam Hussein, at the behest of the West and the Soviet Union, invaded Iran. And now we see that people were rallying under the threat of airstrikes across the country during the war, last Friday in particular, and on the first night. And they celebrated immediately after the ceasefire, which isn't really a ceasefire, it's a cessation of hostilities. The Iranians have not agreed to a ceasefire. They said that if the Israelis strike, we will hit them back very hard. But the point is that the West miscalculated big time. The Iranian people today, and this is maybe the most important point of all, the Iranian people today, those young people who didn't see the revolution, who did not experience the war, Saddam Hussein's invasion, many of them young, liberal, who were influenced by the West. The Persian media funded by Western governments had an influence on many of them. They see the West for what it really is now. They see an unprovoked war, the murder of women and children, all being carried out, and they see that the liberal media, the conservative media, all are the same, whether it's Breitbart or the New York Times or CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, they're all supporting aggression. And that has changed the mentality of that segment of society, which thought differently of the West than people like myself. And that shattered that narrative, that shattered that worldview. So the United States has destroyed its small foothold in Iran among some youth in particular by carrying out this act of aggression and by supporting a genocidal regime in killing innocent Iranians without justification and without provocation.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Mohammad Marandi is our guest. Mohammad, thank you so much for joining the Socialist Program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor.